Hello students, this is Mr. Willis bringing back another episode of College Prep World History. This time we're going to be covering South and Southeast Asian imperialism as well as United States imperialism. And we're going to try to bring this to you in a as quick as concise manner as we possibly can, but there is a lot of material to cover. So let's dive right into it. And previously, we've covered imperialism and the characteristics of imperialism. Mr. Gordon covered the 4 different types of imperialism. We're going to cover several of them today, including direct and indirect imperialism or control by an empire over a smaller country or an inferior country, according to the Europeans. And so we're going to cover areas like India, which is the crown jewel of the British Empire. And we're going to cover places like the Philippines. And finally, we're going to end off with a discussion about the U.S. imperial takeover of Hawaii. All right, so on our first slide here, we have a picture of the last queen of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani. Probably butchered the name, but we try our best here. All right, and the queen, we're not going to get too much into her story until the end here, but unfortunately for the queen, she serves as the last queen of Hawaii as an independent nation, and before its admittance into the United States under President Grover Cleveland as a state into the Union. All right, so before we talk about Hawaii, let's talk a little bit about the British and their control of India. So as we take a look at India as a whole, it's really one of the most compelling imperialistic stories that we cover in all of imperialism. And the main reason why is because of the size and the population of India. India is one of the most populous nations in all of the world. It is considered today as the largest democracy in the world. It has the largest population and is the largest democracy, even bigger than the United States. Maybe not as successful, especially as we get into the latter half of the 20th century and many of their leaders are assassinated because of religious volatility inside of India. But before we can talk about things like that, we have to talk about the British control. Now, as Mr. Gordon previously stated to you guys, there's both good and bad things that occur when an empire takes over another part of the world, and there is no difference here in India. The biggest thing here is that it is an economic takeover. And what I mean by that is the British East India Company, which is chartered, which is basically given a blessing by the British government, they're the ones that really take over the economic factors in India. And so the biggest step here is that India is taking over because of their abundance of natural resources. And that's at the bottom of this slide that you'll see some of the most important that they have. Now, as they take over India, you're going to see a direct control of India. The British are actually going to send governors to India in order to govern over the Indian people. For example, the British leader of the British Army at the American Revolution, he loses, and as punishment, he is banished. Lord Cornwallis is banished to become governor of India after his loss in the Americas. So imagine your choices. You beat the Americans, you get to have American land rewarded by the king. You lose, you're banished to become governor of India. So that is what happens to Lord Cornwallis after his defeat to the Americans during the American Revolution. So they set up an army of Indian soldiers. They're called Sepoys, so make sure you write this down. Sepoys, Sepoys. This is basically British officers training Indian soldiers. And those British officers will be their commanders in the field. And this is one way to exert power over a colonized people, is to empower the British commanders to train the Indian soldiers to become much more European. And there is no difference here in India. The Indian soldiers will become much more European when it comes to training military. All right, and India is seen as the crown jewel of the British Empire, or the jewel in the crown. And when we think of the jewel in the crown, we think of the largest jewel that is in that crown. That is India when it comes to the British Empire. And this is because it is the most valuable colony of all the colonies, especially after the British lose the Americas during the American Revolution. And a couple of those particular items that are very valuable to the British as they hold this imperial power, this imperial control over the Indian people, are a couple of different raw materials. Number one, tea. Right? Tea is really, really important, obviously, for the British. The British drink large quantities of tea, and if they can't get the tea from India, they're going to try to get the tea from other places. They're going to get tea from China, and later on we'll be talking about China as an imperial power as well, being taken over by the British. Cotton. We know through our study of the Industrial Revolution that cotton played a very important role in the formation of textile manufacturing, and Indian cotton is a really valuable raw material for the British. Something I didn't mention on the slide, but salt. Salt is also acquired on the shorelines of India. It becomes a very important piece, especially if you're in Mr. Gordon's class and you're going to be watching Gandhi. They're going to be talking about the Salt March with you. And then the final product, which has a direct effect on trade with China and Britain, would be the product opium. Opium is an addictive drug. It is made from a plant, and it is utilized by the British to exploit or take advantage of the Chinese people to try to get more and more tea from the Chinese. So once those Chinese people become addicted to the opium drug through the trade with the British, then they're going to want more and more. They're going to demand more and more opium, and they're going to get more and more tea for a smaller price, right? And so it's going to lead to a trade imbalance between the British and the Chinese. But that product is coming from India. So in a way, the British are exploiting both the Indian people as well as the Chinese throughout this formation of triangular trade. Our next slide, it talks about the pros and cons of imperialism in India, and it's important to note that it's not just cons. They're not just negative effects that occur when you have imperialism over another people. Obviously, you don't want to be conquered. You don't want to be controlled by somebody else. However, what is brought to the Indian people is modernization. And one of those big important steps is the formation of the third largest railroad system in the world, with the help of the steamship or the steam engine and railways that are created in India. So the British influence in the borders of India is wide. It is important. It is the formation of railroads, the formation of modern bridges and roads and irrigation systems that Mr. Gordon had mentioned to you guys before. These are all really important. Health care, bringing Western medicine to the Indian people becomes vitally important, as well as education. When you learn about Gandhi, Gandhi becomes a lawyer. Mohandas Gandhi is sent to England to learn to become a lawyer and learns about English law, and this is one of the reasons why Gandhi is successful in his methods of nonviolent non-cooperation, is that he knows how to bend British law as the leader of the Indian independence movement. Now the cons, obviously, are that the Indian people are subjugating or giving up their power to the British people, both economically and politically. They're basically putting their fate into the hands of the British, and they're entrusting that the British are going to do what is right for the Indian people. Now, we're going to see shortly that that is not the case. The British, in some cases, exert racial superiority, just like they did over the African people. When we talked about the scramble of Africa or scramble for Africa, they're also going to exert racial superiority over the Indian people, and the cultural beliefs of the Indian people, such as Hinduism and Islam, are going to be thrown into the fray when Christian missionaries come into India and try to convert these Muslims, these Hindus, into Christians. And so there's going to be a conflict between Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism when it comes to that relationship. Also, the British are going to restrict Indian-owned businesses. So imagine if an Indian business was selling salt, right? And I mentioned salt to you guys before. They were selling salt to various countries. For example, the British government would say, well, now you can only sell salt to Britain. And what that does, again, when you don't have competition for goods, when you're not selling goods to a wide variety, a diverse group of people, that is hurtful to the business owner. It's hurtful to those owners because you don't have any variation in price, and the British, who are controlling the trade, can actually decrease the price to make it profitable for the British as opposed to profitable for the Indian business owners. There's going to be a massive dependence on cash crops. That's a bad thing, especially if you have famine or if you have a drought, which was very often in India. India is a very hot and humid location. And so sometimes you're not going to have the greatest of weather or climate. And so therefore, when you're highly dependent on cash crops such as wheat and cotton, then if you have a bad harvest, you're not going to make large sums of money, or people are going to starve to death. And then finally, the cons would be the cultural disruption that is brought about by the British people and their control over the Indian people, who are a mix of Hindu and Muslim. They're going to exert, as I mentioned to you guys before, they're going to try to exert their influence through Christianity, or the spreading of Christianity to the Indian people, which is met with very mild success. There are some that are converted to Christianity. However, if you know anything about history of India, it is predominantly Hindu, and today it is very much Hindu, so much so that there was a partition of India, which happens after Gandhi. So we'll get into that later. Our next slide leads to the rebellion, the Sepoy Rebellion, which is the first crack in the armor for the British. The British are ultimately successful in repelling the rebellion, the Sepoy Rebellion. Now remember, Sepoys are Indian soldiers who were under the command of British commanders. Well, there are several different reasons as to why there's a rebellion. I mentioned one in the previous slide. There is a massive amount of disrespect for the cultural practices of the Indian people. One of those is the belief that in both Hindu and the Muslim faith, that a cow or a pig is an unholy animal, and so therefore you don't really touch the product of those animals when it comes to food or other products. Well, you need a lubricant when you have a gun in order to fire the bullet or fire the cartridge when you have rifles. And what the British did was that they soaked the cartridges that were being used by the Indian soldiers in the lard of cows and pigs. And when you're a soldier back in the time of imperialism, the 19th century, when you're firing that rifle, in order to prepare the rifle for firing, you need to bite off the end of the cartridge. So you put it in your mouth and you bite it off to break it off to pour in the gunpowder. Well, what the British did was they soaked those cartridges in those lards. So what they were causing was a massive disrespect of the cultural beliefs of the Indian people by soaking those cartridges in cow and pig lard. And when the sepoys found out about this, coupled with other reasons as to why they were upset with British incursions in India, whether it was Christianity trying to assert its dominance, or whether it was this disrespect of their cultural beliefs, it led to a rebellion of those sepoys. And they were successful to a point where they had actually captured the city of Delhi in India, but ultimately they did not survive because they had a weak leadership. Okay, so imagine being ultra dependent on the British commanders to lead you. You now no longer have leadership, and so therefore the rebellion was put down because of that weak leadership. So, what does it lead to? It leads to direct control from 1757 to 1947 of India by Britain. Right? They can no longer trust that the Indian people could govern themselves and be what we call a puppet government, where they were following the rules of the British. So you have a direct rule over the Indian people by British commanders. So imagine 200 years of direct rule, nearly 200 years of direct rule by the British is going to be upcoming. And so over that time, there's going to be increased racism and social unrest within the Indian boundaries, and it's going to take massive amounts of effort to try to quell that unrest and that rebellion. So our last slide when it comes to India will be this slide on Ram Mohan Roy, and so I want you guys to write down his name. Ram Mohan Roy. So now think about how the British control the government over an increasing amount of time. The Indian people want to have some sort of representation, just like the Americans did prior to the American Revolution. They're going to want to have some sort of representation within the government. And so therefore, Ram Mohan Roy steps into the spotlight, and he is considered the father of modern India, because he says in order for the Indian people to take a much bigger role in governing themselves, they're going to have to get rid of some of the old cultural beliefs and traditions that they have. So I'll go over a couple of them. Number one, child marriages. It is really popular in India and among the Hindu belief, especially when you're a conservative Hindu, that in order for you to stay or rise in rank, and we'll talk about social classes here in a second, in order for you to stay or to rise in rank, you need to have an arranged marriage with another family. So you want to make sure at the very least you're maintaining the same privileges you had when your parents were around. And so what you would do was you would arrange a marriage between your daughter or son with another family's daughter or son, and they would get married at a childhood age. Now, we would think of this as absurd here in America, but this is a part of the cultural beliefs back then in order for their families to maintain their status. This was mandatory for them to be able to continue to take the steps to maintain power and prestige within their society. And so this was very common. To us, seems absurd. And that's because we live in a democratic system that believes in individual freedoms and rights, whereas these people are being controlled by what we call Brahmin, which are religious clergy in the Hindu faith. And this is a cultural belief that existed for thousands of years. The second one was what we call the caste system that we have in parentheses on this slide. And the caste system is an idea that we have a very strict, a very rigid societal makeup within India. So if you're a Brahmin, you're at the top of that social pyramid. You're the best, right? It would be like being a noble in Europe, in one of the European kingdoms. You are number one, or the first class in France, the Roman Catholic clergy. That's basically what the Brahmin status would be. And then you have this descending order of social classes that are very strict, and it is very difficult for you to move up in these social classes. However, moving down is pretty common if you're not careful. So you don't want to be at the bottom of the social class system, which are basically what we call the untouchables, people that would be considered dirty. And when we say dirty, we're not just saying, somebody who hasn't taken a shower. We're talking about people who deal in dirty businesses. So, for example, somebody that would be a trash collector would be an untouchable. You don't want to talk to them. Somebody who deals in death and is a caretaker for the death, that is an untouchable. You don't want to be a part of those social classes. So you do not associate yourself with those types of people. And then finally, again, what we would consider absurd here in America, because we have different cultural beliefs, is Ram Mohan Roy is successful in trying to get the Indian people to overturn the practice of sati, S-A-T-I. Sati is the idea that if your husband dies, the wife will throw herself onto the burning pile, what we call a pyre, P-Y-R-E, the funeral pyre. As they burn the remains of the body of the husband, the wife would throw herself onto the funeral pyre and commit suicide to be with her husband. And Ram Mohan Roy says we need to get rid of this idea if we want to take the next step in India's progress. So that's a little bit of the history of India. I'm going to continue on. I'm going to talk a little bit about Southeast Asia and then U.S. imperialism here. So our next slide is a description of what happens in colonial impact in Asia. We're not going to talk specifically about each country, but just understand this is Southeast Asia, places like Vietnam, who later on will have a war to try to free themselves from European contact. But again, like India, these places are offering huge profits to the Europeans because they have materials, they have raw materials that are necessary for the Europeans to manufacture and to take advantage of, especially tin and rubber, which are two products. Rubber specifically, if we get into the early part of the 20th century, rubber, you're going to need it for tires, you're going to need it for automobiles, and so Southeast Asia has this in abundance, and they're going to try to take advantage of that. They're going to try to take advantage of those materials and produce greater wealth. They're going to improve communication and transportation in Asia. It's going to be reciprocal. So they're going to give back to the people of Southeast Asia and advance them, have them take the next step in their technological advancement. And just like what we talked about with India, education and health and sanitation are all going to be improved, so therefore people are going to live longer. However, again, a negative would be that religions are going to meld together. Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, there's a lot more Buddhists in Southeast Asia, and Muslims. Indonesia is the largest Muslim occupied or Muslim practiced territory today. So these are going to clash with one another. Moving on into U.S. imperialism, the Spanish-American War in 1898, where the U.S. defeats the Spanish, they're going to benefit greatly from this. They're going to actually earn the territory of the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and Guam. They're going to get all of those territories. And in particular, we're going to talk here just really briefly about the Philippines. So you're going to go ahead and write down that the U.S. defeats the Spanish in 1898, and they get the territories of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. So in the Philippines, the Filipino people who had been under the imperialistic control of the Spanish are now under the control of the United States. And it's at this time that they try to free themselves from imperial control, but they're unsuccessful in doing so. However, it does lead to the rise of a very important family, and that family is the Aguinaldo family. And Emilio Aguinaldo actually tries to lead a rebellion against the United States in 1902, but is unsuccessful. However, what does come out of this is that, again, just like in Southeast Asia, just like in India, the United States is going to modernize the Philippines. It's going to modernize the Philippines. So make sure that you write down Emilio Aguinaldo is unsuccessful in his rebellion against the United States in 1902, and the Philippines is modernized, both technologically speaking, with their infrastructure, with roads and railroads and hospitals and schools. Those are all great impacts. Those are the good impacts when it comes to the U.S.'s impact in the Philippines. And that leads us finally to Hawaii. So this is the one that really I love to teach to the class, just because a lot of us don't really understand, that the Hawaiian story, or the end of the independent Kingdom of Hawaii, is a very sad story, unfortunately. And it's mainly due to the impact of U.S. businessmen in Hawaii that Hawaii becomes a state in the Union. And so by the time we reach the middle of the 19th century, so around the 1850s, American businessmen had established sugar plantations in Hawaii and were making large sums of money in Hawaii, working around the concept of the Kingdom of Hawaii. They were making large sums of money and importing or exporting sugar into the United States from the Kingdom of Hawaii. Well, in 1890, the McKinley Tariff Act eliminates taxes on sugar, and what it's going to do is that it's going to make imported sugar from other countries totally inexpensive. All right? So if you're doing this, there is an added benefit to trying to annex the United States, or have the U.S. annex the territory of Hawaii as a republic, or as part of a territory of the United States. Well, of course, the Kingdom of Hawaii is going to resist this. They're not going to want to become a part of the United States. They want to remain, have their independence. They are a kingdom. They've been around for a long period of time. Their history is very deep, right? And so there's going to be this clash between U.S. businessmen, the U.S. president, and the Queen of Hawaii, who is Queen, as you guys can see on this next slide. And you saw at the very first slide that I showed you guys, this is Queen Liliuokalani. And the Queen, it's her versus wealthy business owners. And these business owners effectively push her out of the monarchy. They get her to abdicate the throne. She gives up power because of her inability to fight against the economic interests of U.S. businessmen, but also the power, ultimately the power of the United States government. And so in 1894, the Queen is replaced with a president of the First Hawaiian Republic, and you might notice this name here. This is Sanford Dole on the bottom of this slide. Sanford Dole is from the same Dole family that you would get Dole pineapples. So that family's history also runs deep in Hawaiian history. He becomes the president of the First Hawaiian Republic, and the first step is taken where Hawaii goes from being a kingdom to an independent Hawaiian Republic, and then much later on, the United States decides ultimately to annex the Hawaiian Republic as a territory, a U.S. territory, and then later on into the 20th century, Hawaii becomes one of the states of the United States. So our last thing for the day here is we're going to show you a video on this particular ending of the Hawaiian kingdom and the last story of Queen Liliuokalani with you guys. So we just want you to sit back and watch the film, and once the film ends, that'll be the end of the presentation. So again, on behalf of the entire World History team, Mr. Gordon, Ms. Pancini, and Mrs. Atwood, I am Mr. Willis, and I am happy that you guys were able to see this video today.
Just over a century ago, there was an isolated kingdom called Hawaii, an independent nation with a parliament, its own flag, a national anthem, and a beloved queen, Liliuokalani. But in 1893, she was removed from her throne with the help of the United States Marines. It was a great loss to her people.
If you can imagine something within your own culture that is tremendously important to you, that is suddenly done away with, just totally ripped out and gone. If you can imagine yourself relating to something like that, that's what we went through.
Liliuokalani was descended from generations of chiefs, revered by the Hawaiians as gods. She had been educated by Americans. A poet and composer, she dined at the White House, was a guest at Buckingham Palace, but nothing had prepared her for the crisis she would face as queen.
Liliu was well-versed in the Western culture, well-versed in the Hawaiian culture, and knew the values of both sides, and knew the inevitable of what was going to happen to Hawaii.
When Liliu was born in 1838, the chanting lasted for days. It was the way to herald new arrivals among the ali'i, the high chiefs of the islands. But by this time, many of the old ways had already vanished. It would take 10 days for news of the Queen's overthrow to reach the outside world. On January 18, 1893, the day after she surrendered, Liliuokalani went for a ride in her carriage. On her way back, she told her driver not to turn into the palace, but instead to take her to her private residence, Washington Place. She firmly believed her exile would be brief, that the United States would recognize the error and she would be reinstated. On February 1st, Minister Stevens ceremonially raised the American flag over the government building. Liliuokalani wrote in her diary, "Time may wear off the feeling of injury, but my dear flag, the Hawaiian flag, that a strange flag should wave over it. May heaven look down on these missionaries and punish them for their deeds." The palace was renamed the Executive Building. Martial law was declared and would be enforced by the ragtag army of the provisional government.
There was a blackening out of things, of news. But our people were able to find a means of protest. Because they were told by their leader, their queen, not to take up arms, they began wearing hatbands that said Aloha Aina, that meant patriotism. They began to make quilts that had the Hawaiian flag because the Hawaiian flag had been banned.
Here she was denied all reading material except for her prayer book. During this time, she composed a number of pieces, including the Queen's Prayer. Fearing that she would die a prisoner, Liliuokalani embroidered a quilt with a record of her life. Lydia Kamakaeha Liliuokalani ascended the throne January 29, 1891, dethroned January 17, 1893. Imprisoned at Iolani Palace, we began this quilt there. It was during her imprisonment that she would formally abdicate the throne.
Under the threat that 6 of her people will be executed, she signs a document that is not only an abdication for herself, but a statement that the monarchy itself is over, that the kingdom is no more. The news strikes the Hawaiian people with great force because to them she was still queen.
On September 6, 1895, after 8 months' imprisonment, Liliuokalani was released on parole to Washington Place. It would take another 2 years before her civil rights were fully restored. The provisional government had established the Republic of Hawaii with Sanford Dole as president, but they had still not succeeded in their ultimate goal, annexation to the United States. In 1898, when the Spanish-American War broke out, American troops headed to the Philippines. President McKinley recognized the strategic value of Hawaii and supported a congressional resolution for annexation. On August 12, 1898, in a grand ceremony, President Dole formally yielded the sovereignty and public property of the Hawaiian Islands to the United States. The Stars and Stripes was slowly raised over Iolani Palace, and the Hawaiian flag was brought down for the last time. But few Hawaiians would witness the ceremony. Most spent the day at home, behind closed blinds.
On the actual day of annexation, the Queen shuttered herself at Washington Place, surrounded by her court, by the princes, by her ladies-in-waiting, and they had a solemn picture taken. On the other side at Iolani Palace, there were sharpshooters pointed out. There was still tension in the air that something might happen, but when the Hawaiian flag was lowered, it was said that it was cut into small little 2 to 3 inch ribbons and given out as tokens of remembrance to the sons and daughters of the missionary families, so that they could keep those as little tokens of their great victory over the Hawaiian kingdom and the end of the tyranny of the Hawaiian monarchy.
Liliuokalani would live for another 20 years as an American citizen in the United States territory of Hawaii. By the time of her death at the age of 79, she had become the embodiment of the kingdom itself and of its loss. For weeks after her funeral, strange events were recorded in the islands. Volcanoes erupted, and the seas turned an odd hue from the sudden appearance of a multitude of red fish. It was as if the elements recognized that the kingdom was no more.